Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome back to American Medieval. I am Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Ellen Arnold. Dr. Arnold is a senior lecturer at Ohio State. She is a historian of the environment and is particularly interested in how pre-modern people understood the world around her. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Matthew. This can be fun.
It will be fun. That's a promise that I like to make to listeners. And I don't honestly know if I've let them down yet, but we're going to find out. So, I mean, I'm sure I'll get lots of comments if that ever happens. It's not going to happen today. I know that for
Not at all.
100%. Not at all. Absolutely. So anyway, the way that I like to start this podcast is with a silly question, and it involves time machines. Because I think, and I think I'm right about this, is that anybody who studies the past, historians or whatever other discipline, like we all have kind of complicated feelings about time machines generally. And we could talk about those complicated feelings maybe later. But the question is actually maybe a little bit different. So imagine that we actually do have a time machine, and that time machine has been presented to you, Ellen Arnold, and with the caveat that you have to go back and talk to a young version of yourself, a childhood version of yourself, and tell them that someday you will be a medieval historian. How does young Ellen Arnold react to that news?
I suppose if I went back to the right time when I was living in Germany as a kid, when my dad was in the army and spending weekends exploring castles and climbing all over ruins we probably shouldn't have been climbing all over and playing knights with my brothers, I would have been thrilled.
Okay.
If I
Okay.
went back to high school, Ellen, who wanted to do nothing more than be the next Carl Sagan,
Oh, okay.
I would be confused.
Fantastic. All right. Excellent. That's really great. And it's also really typical when I ask this question. Everybody has kind of their own age that they're thinking of, like when I ask that question. But you've captured 2 things. So first, before we get to the medieval stuff, I want to ask about Carl Sagan. Like, so you were super into astronomy then? Or did you want to be like a TV presenter?
Oh, no, I wanted to be a scientist.
A scientist.
I
Okay.
wanted to be a scientist, and I loved, in retrospect, I loved the way that he turned science into narrative.
Oh, okay.
And the way that he and other science communicators who I respected told stories about nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really what I now realize I was drawn to.
Yeah.
And that is what I get to do being an environmental historian.
There we go. So you have perfect. So actually, high school Ellen would have been maybe confused about being a medievalist, but once it was explained to her, then she would have been like, makes perfect sense. This is the
Yes.
kind of thing that we want to do. It's funny you mentioned Carl Sagan, though, because my wife and I were talking relatively recently about kind of experiences with distance learning, which is a weird conversation, but, we both work in universities, so it's things that come up. But she was telling me that in college, she took a distance learning, and this is dating us, we're older. She took a distance learning course with Carl Sagan in the sense that they mailed her materials like in the mail, and then she watched a video cassette of Carl Sagan's Cosmos and then had to write essays and then like kind of mail them back, and that's what it was. But it was also like, yeah, it was incredibly compelling, and she was talking about that specifically about how well these complicated issues, these complicated kind of concepts were just kind of like presented in, kind of a layman's terms for, in her case, like a 19-year-old person, right?
And I got to read Cosmos in a humanities class in 8th grade.
Oh,
And
okay.
it really just shaped my fascination with science.
Mm-hmm.
The ideas that science was something that changes and grows and evolves just really stuck with me. And
Yeah.
I went on from Cosmos to become obsessed with his book Comet.
Okay. Okay.
And just really this idea of science as something to talk about,
Mm.
then I guess filtered back into the way that I think of environmental history as a way of talking about stories and looking at the ways that people tell stories to make sense of the world in the same ways that Sagan and Durian
Yeah.
and all of the other great science communicators, including Jane Goodall,
Hmm.
right? They can make meaning out of science that resonates in a storytelling way.
Yeah, and I think that's, kind of history at its best is part of that process too. Like any kind, right? Is just like thinking about how people in the past were trying to make sense of their world. I mean, that's a really kind of coherent and concise explanation of kind of what that is. Now, environmental history, of course, is thinking about kind of the natural world and the impact that that has kind of on pre-modern, well, in our case, right, pre-modern populations. So was that influence, like the fact that you were not just interested kind of in the natural world generally in the storytelling aspect, but the medieval, was that influenced by your time in Germany then? Like, do you see that as kind of coming out of that? Or was there like a renewal of interest kind of after that, like in college, that you kind of see as part of your intellectual journey?
I think that my time in Germany created a sense of appreciation of European places
Mm,
and European spaces in my world. And my sense of the past growing up was a lot deeper than had I just grown up with American history as my main subject. As I'm sure that we'll see on your podcast as it progresses, there's always a whole bunch of stuff going on in the Americas much earlier than modern American history. I think growing up in Europe let me see that a lot more than most Americans get to see.
yes, there were in fact lots of people in on these continents, and they were doing stuff in that same period, right? Like, so whether we call that kind of a medieval Americas or something like that, like that's another conversation. We'll maybe another episode or something like that. But the idea, right, that medieval Europe was kind of unique in that it had kind of cultural developments is just a silly thing that unfortunately too many of our predecessors kind of were complicit in presenting to the world. And now we're trying to kind of undo that work, right? So, and in your own work with thinking about kind of environmental history, like I would think that those longer and kind of wider connections are tremendously important. Is that fair to say? Or is that really, are you much more interested in kind of what's happening at smaller local levels?
Both.
Both.
In
Okay. Yeah.
in
Both
some
and
ways,
yes.
both and in some ways. So the other thing that got me really hooked in graduate school that shaped my trajectory was falling absolutely head over heels for medieval hagiography
Okay.
and recognizing in the universal seeming stories of saints that there was a very particular locality that's
Mm,
buried underneath the stories, that there's specific people living in specific places who find ways to tell stories about universal truths.
sure.
And that for so long, people had focused so much on the universal truth aspect that they'd
Mm,
overlooked the people living in very specific places telling stories. And so I get really interested in how these types of documents can be both big and speak to broader medieval values and large cultural trends across time and space, but also be written by somebody who lives next to a particular river.
yes.
And so includes that river in their stories.
Yeah, and I mean, that's really interesting because I mean, not being an environmental historian myself, that's not something that I'm thinking about. But as you're talking about that, thinking about the hagiographies that I have worked with, the landscape is tremendously important, right? To hagiographies, all the way back to kind of the kind of great examples of late antiquity, which become the models kind of later on, right? Anthony of Alexandria, Martin of Tours, the Desert Fathers in Palestine and in Egypt as well, right? And then all the way through. So, do you have like a favorite example? Like, if I'm a young student coming up and saying, like, Professor Arnold, what are you talking about? How is this universal truth really care about the kind of local? First, you say, Matt Gabriel, raise your hand, please. But then you would say,
Absolutely. My favorite piece of hagiography to teach,
okay.
hands down, is the collected hagiographies of Saint Foy.
Ah, Foi of Conch. Lovely, lovely, lovely. Yes,
Yes,
yes, yes.
because they not only let us see a very specific landscape in the stories that the three different authors of miracles tell,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but it's an important landscape that the some of which still exists and the fabric of pilgrimage is still tangible.
Hmm.
But also, we have three very different authors who successively tell very different kinds of stories about the place and the people that surround Caen.
Okay.
And it's just a delight. Plus, mules are raised from the dead.
Mules are raised from the dead, and Foix seems to kick a lot of ass, very frankly, in that as well.
No, she heals the asses.
Yes, but she likes to kill knights, mean knights who are trying to steal peasant wine, and among other things as well.
A goose burns down a house.
A goose
It's
burns
just
down a house.
remarkable.
It's a remarkable collection of text. But just to back up, so can you just give us like 5 seconds on who is Foix, what is the text like, and who are these authors? Because it's such an amazing, rich text available in English translation, I should say.
And we should put that in the notes.
We should put that in notes,
Okay.
absolutely. So, but quick and dirty, Saint Foix of Conques.
It's a collection of miracle stories assembled by a skeptic who is based in urban university France and is rising the ranks as a cleric, Bernard of Angers. And he hears these stories coming out of the countryside on the pilgrimage road to Santiago de Compostela of crazy miracles, blind people being healed multiple times, donkeys rising from the dead, prisoners being released even though they're guilty, geese burning down houses, all sorts of
Hmm.
crazy things. And he is deeply skeptical
Yeah.
because this does not sound like rational, normal, regular miracles. And he believes that it's the country bumpkins making stuff up.
Hmm.
And so he actually, though, has a moment of doubt and faith crisis in his own sense of what is real. And he decides he's basically going to take a sabbatical
Hmm.
and go to this small town and interview people. And he winds up becoming converted.
Yeah.
He winds up falling headfirst into the cult of Foy, believing the people who talk to him, believing in the power of this young martyr who was one of the Roman martyrs from early on in Christian history who winds up with her relics in Caen. She's a young girl. The Latin for her name just simply is Saint Faith. And so
Hmm.
there's a lot of reasons that even today people are
Yeah.
skeptical of the story of this saint. Bernard not only completely buys in, but then commits the rest of his life to recording the stories of her miracles as
Hmm.
told to him by this community.
Yeah.
When he dies, another writer picks up in his place and adds a whole extra book of miracles. And then when that person dies, a fourth writer steps up and continues to tell the stories.
Yeah, there's lots of fascinating things. The text itself is just amazing. It's so rich with all sorts of details and just kind of really kind of vivacious color, like all these weird things, like
Mhm.
you were saying, kind of happening. But then there's the weirdness of the saint itself, right? Like, as you were saying, like this legend of a Roman martyr. She is a young girl. I mean, probably like what? Like, I think like 8 or 9 she's supposed to be, or like extremely young, but then kind of manifests herself in these presents as a young girl. And there's an amazing bit too, I always remember, in which Bernard actually talks about his doubts, which is a really lovely kind of 11th century bit in which I seem to remember there's one part, I don't think it's about Foix specifically, but like he and his friends are on that sabbatical and they see one of these reliquaries that are similar to Foix and they're like, oh, look at these rubes. Like, look at these kind of bumpkins kind of worshiping this reliquary. And then he switches, right? And then beyond that, as you were saying, right, like the landscape plays an incredibly important part because Foix is important in this specific territory, in this specific land, like the lands of the monastery itself. And so that becomes almost, a character in the story that the miracles are telling.
Yeah, it's delightful. Anyone who hasn't read it should read it.
Yes. So, and we'll make sure that you can, if you want, read it as well. So, in a story like that, when we talk about kind of the landscape playing a part, or like it's incredibly important that it's localized around this particular monastery and the lands around Foix, like how do rivers and fields or hills or whatever, like how does the environment kind of generally, which I think most of our listeners would think of as kind of the physical landscape, like how does that play a part in the story?
I can start with Foy and then sort of move to a bit more broader understanding of that question.
Yeah, of course.
A great example with Foy is the fact that she is operating within a landscape that not only has very treacherous routes in and out,
Mm,
but also is a little more agriculturally marginal.
okay.
And so we see stories not only of struggling local farmers, peasants, merchants, livestock owners trying to earn a living in the face of increasing taxation and upper class aggression.
Hmm.
And so there's a lot of, as you pointed out, dead nobles, but
Yeah.
mostly dead nobles who abuse agricultural workers.
Yes. Yes.
And so we see that this kind of perilous, mountainous landscape that we have people who are maybe hanging on a bit by a thread. And when nobles make that even harder, the saint steps in to punish
Yeah.
and to save their livelihoods, to save their donkeys,
Yeah.
to save their harvest, to protect them from weather catastrophes.
And so is that why animals play like such an important part because they are so important to the agricultural workers?
Yes.
Is that kind of what's going on?
Yes. Losing a mule or a donkey or a workhorse instead of like a royal falcon or a palfrey is the equivalent of someone stressed today in America having their car break.
Mm,
And suddenly the way that you've cobbled together a way to keep your family cohesive and fed and comfortable, suddenly there's this giant unexpected obstacle in your way of doing your work, traveling, connecting. And so loss of animals to hardworking medieval peasants and work
yeah.
and laborers was devastating. This is why around the same time in northern France, the Peace of God movement,
Hmm.
which becomes a giant phenomenon of people trying to band together to support universal Christian values, begins with three very simple rules.
Yes.
The first of which is you are anathematized if you kill a peasant's horse or cow or sheep.
Yeah, because those matter, right? And I'm thinking about like, I was making a joke about Fly because Fly is quite vengeful and she's very clearly protective. And, it's used by historians of the Crusades, for example, oftentimes as this kind of early 11th century example of kind of saints becoming very active in the world, literally punishing people, kind of usually as the story goes, and there's problems with that story, kind of in the absence of royal power, saints are filling this kind of political function, right, of protecting the peasants there. But a lot of the actions that she's doing is she's protecting grain stores. She's protecting kind of foodstuffs, right? Those are the things that people are trying to, or these kind of rapacious castellans, these rapacious nobles are trying to steal away and are critically important, as you were saying, like in an economically marginalized or agriculturally marginalized kind of region.
And states actually intervene even in richer zones. One of
Yes,
the
they do.
things, and I think this is one of the things that then makes this a kind of question that can be applied across the range of hagiography, not just in unique cases like Foy. One of the things that really jumped out at me when I was researching for my most recent book on rivers was I couldn't pin down a single place. I wound up having this broad wealth of places that I pulled into the story because all the saints
Mhm.
step in some way or another once we hit
Yeah.
miracle stories and their posthumous lives. They all step in to protect the monks, to protect the communities, to protect their families,
Mhm.
broadly construed to be all the people not only belonging to the monastery or the church affiliated with the saint or their relics, but all the people who are economically bound up to those communities and who
Yeah.
rely on the stability of those communities for their own agricultural stability. And so all across the board, we see the saints not only stepping in to protect the environment from malicious harm,
Mhm.
but also using the environment to punish malefactors, using nature as a way of wreaking vengeance and punishing bad behavior.
So are you talking about like creating storms or something like that? Like,
Creating storms.
okay.
One of my favorite examples is people who tried to steal beehives from a monastery
Oh, okay.
and stole a boat, rowed over to the monastic lands across the river, put the beehives in the boat, and then on the way back, the bees escaped the hives and stung the people to death.
Were the beehives recovered or are they just still floating out there in the
They
middle of
were
the
recovered.
Okay, they were recovered. Okay.
Boats washed up on shore with the dead thieves, and the bees were put back in place.
Yes, and they were very docile as they were placed back. So the natural environment is kind of part of the saint's world in that way.
Yes, the saints can not only respond to human actions and use human agents through visions, through dream quests,
Sure.
through direct instructions, but they can actually use the natural world and manipulate it as part of their existence between heaven and earth.
Yeah.
They can change things.
They can change things. Yeah, no, and I was thinking too about one of the popular conceptions about the Middle Ages is, or one of the few things I should say that people know about the Middle Ages are people like Francis of Assisi, right? And one of those things is kind of his familiarity with animals. But I mean, what you're saying, and I think what medievalists have known for a long time, is like this is a much older thing, right? The relationship of sanctity with the natural environment and the harmony that they can bring to kind of set things in order goes back much further than that, right?
Yes, and one of the things that I find super interesting about this is Francis is often set up as like the only medieval saint to love nature.
Yes.
But I think that one of the things that you see when you really slow down and look deeply is that all of these stories are about lots of people throughout the Middle Ages knowing
Mm,
places and knowing animals,
yeah.
not only knowing things about sheep, but knowing specific sheep,
Yes.
but also loving them. There is a kind of sense of care, and back to
Mhm.
sheep pastoralism.
Yeah.
There is the sense, the Christian idea of the pastor.
Mhm.
That includes a care for nature, a care for not only humans and human souls, but a care for creation.
Yeah.
That's really deep.
And that extends beyond, living beings to the natural environment as well, do you think? Like, is there a concern, or maybe another way to ask that question, right, is there a concern about respecting the sanctity of God's creation as a whole, or is it just a relationship that's built on kind of mutual need when you're dealing with, in some cases, kind of livestock in an agricultural setting?
That's a lot
Is
trickier.
that a wrong question?
It's not a wrong question.
Okay.
It's
All
a
right. Fair
question
enough.
that I don't feel fully equipped to answer because, in many ways, the documents and ideas and people and stories I work with are about particularity.
Mm,
And the broad themes they talk about are about human souls.
okay.
And so, to answer that question, we would probably need to get into much more patristics type scholarship of the university
Sure.
cultures of the 12th century. What are the people reading Isidore professionally saying about the way God works in the natural world and what nature is? That's a category of evidence I've just not really gotten as deep into.
Fair enough. Totally. I'm a
Yep.
babe in the woods here, so I'm just asking questions.
The animals are compelling, right?
The animals are compelling. Yes.
Because it gets us not only it gets our attention, because we still like stories about animals because humans like animals, but it lets the medieval audience think about what is the difference between people and animals.
Mhm.
And one of the things that, to go all the way back to Foy, one of the things that bothers Bernard at first, and then he becomes an apologist for it, is Saint Foy raising mules from the dead.
Mhm.
It's like, why should a mere animal that doesn't have a soul be raised from the dead? And it causes him great doubt. And then he goes down and he's like, oh, I get
Yeah.
it. It's because, hey, it's a minor part of creation, but it's still a part of creation and it lives and it's a needed part and it was unjustly punished. And so
Mhm.
it gets to come back.
Yeah. And it becomes a part of, in that particular story too, like we were talking about, it's important to Foi's human followers as well, right? Like that mule served a devoted servant of Foi. So they need that mule in order to effectively live and to feed their family and stuff like that. So it's not just kind of the instrumental kind of thing of like raising the mule from the dead. It's all the follow-on implications from that as well.
And I guess this is a way that we can use the animals to get to this bigger question that you asked,
Sure.
is that around the same time that Bernard is writing, we also see the start of what will sort of come to be called the bestiary craze,
Mm.
which is when monastic communities and university communities and burgeoning schools try to find ways of assembling universal knowledge and try to find ways to re-explain classical Christian knowledge to a broader reading audience. And one of the ways that they do this is they work with both Isidore of Seville, but also a source known as the Physiologus. And they go back and they collect and accumulate all of the knowledge about all of the created world in the forms of bestiaries, which look at animals, lapidaries that look at minerals, and then herbal books or
Hmm.
bariums that look at the vegetable world that God created. And they not only try to put in, and here's back to me being interested in scientific storytelling,
Yeah.
they tried to put in all of the scientific evidence that is there for what this
Oh.
animal is, what this stone is, what this plant is, but then also all of the moral stories that can be learned from the natural life of those animals. One of my favorites is the elephant, who is used throughout the bestiary conversations as a potential archetype for the good Christian,
Mm.
and potentially even one of the animals that can stand in for Christ's lessons out of the New Testament.
Hmm. Hmm.
But they use these books to not only accumulate scientific knowledge, but also to then take the animal and show why that animal is woven into a bigger fabric of meaning and creation and morality, and what are good human uses of that animal and what are bad human uses of that animal. Not only how should we behave ethically around that animal, but how does that animal teach us how to be ethical?
Yeah, I mean, a totalizing system is a totalizing system, right? So like everything has to fit. If you're a monastic, a writer, a Christian monk in the 12th, 13th century or something like that, like it's just got to fit. Like it's just you're starting from that premise. But you're talking about kind of accumulating scientific knowledge, and I think that one of the great assumptions about the period is that this did not include ancient knowledge. Is that fair or is that unfair?
That is unfair.
I'm shocked to hear that.
Things that didn't happen for 500.
Yes, exactly.
They had classical knowledge. What gets in the way of that, where that comes from, and this is
Mm,
something that I work backwards with a lot with my students, is there were indeed some classical treatises that medieval Europeans did not have access to
absolutely, sure.
because they'd not been translated into Latin out of Greek or other ancient languages, because the manuscripts hadn't made it across all of the geographical barriers it takes to move books and move knowledge.
Mhm.
One of the things we often forget when we are thinking about how we learn knowledge today, how quickly I, living in Ohio, can have some window into what's happening in California or in Florida or in modern France,
Yeah, yeah.
is knowledge could only move as fast as people could move
Yes.
and could only be brought with people as they were making these giant trips around the medieval world. And so some classical knowledge was not in existence in pre-Crusade Europe. Much of it was, though.
Yeah.
And we sometimes get lost in the conversation about rediscovering Aristotle, for
Yep.
example, via the Crusades. And certain works of Aristotle were, in fact, not known until more Europeans learned Arabic and were able to translate Arabic works back into Greek and
Yeah.
the linguistic pluralization of Europe because of the Crusades made a bunch of texts accessible in a new way.
Yeah.
But a lot of the ancient knowledge did get conveyed not only directly, but also indirectly through earlier medieval translations and adaptations and rewrites.
Yeah, and different kind of manuscripts that sometimes still survive, right? In which they have small snippets or small portions of classical treatises or commentaries on those treatises or something like that. But yeah, we place a lot of emphasis sometimes in our teaching. And I mean, I certainly have been guilty of this in the past as well when I'm trying to explain like this basic concept is about this efflorescence of learning in the 12th and 13th century. As you said, like Iberia is this mixing place and this moment of great translation between things. But there was a lot of that kind of going on beforehand and a lot of manuscripts that were circulating that we maybe we don't even have evidence of because as you said like information only travels with people like they have to tell you or they have to give you a piece of parchment or something like that in order for you to do that it's it's a lot different than now. Other history podcast alert. This Guy Sucked is a history podcast for haters by haters. Join historian Dr. Claire Aubin and a new expert every week to pull back the scholarly curtain on some of the world's biggest bummers. No dead person is safe, and the show's guests prove that the best part of understanding the past is criticizing it. My favorite episode so far was the one I was on, of course, where I yelled about Charlemagne, and sorry, I got a bit sweary there. But then my second favorite episode is every other one. History isn't just names and dates, it's names and hate? Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Don't blame the podcast for that one. Instead, go find This Guy Sucked every Thursday wherever you listen to podcasts. All right, back into the time machine, back to the Middle Ages. So, how did classical learning about the natural world kind of move in these periods? You know, the other thing too, like we've been talking about monks, for example, we talked a lot about hagiography, you know, we've been talking about monasteries, but like this is not a story of, you know, and your scholarship has shown like this isn't just a story about kind of elite learned culture necessarily. Like this is about kind of people, like broadly conceived, like encountering the world, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the shift I would want to make in this conversation, not only because I'm not a scholar of reception, which is how
Mm-hmm.
we trace which scholars had access to which books and
Yeah, yeah.
who read what treatises. That's one way to find out how classical knowledge moved, right? Is we can
Sure.
follow those kinds of snippets that you mentioned. We can look for people lightly paraphrasing the ideas of earlier scholars
Mm-hmm.
or even arguing with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's a great source that I have been teaching lately of a early Christian Cosmas Indicupletes.
Okay.
He's Cosmas, the Indian sea traveler. He's a early Christian who's a merchant and who travels around the late antique world and decides that, unlike classical reception, that the world was not round. The world was a box.
Oh,
And he
okay.
makes it match the tabernacle out of the Old Testament.
Oh, sure. Why not? Okay, great.
Why not? Right?
Yeah.
He's completely on his own. He's out there. No one else agrees with him. All the other medieval thinkers are like, that's wacky. Of course, the world is round. You're
Yeah.
a merchant. Why do you not recognize this? But he literally gets into the middle of it in his discussion. He's like, and this classical scholar is wrong, and this classical scholar is wrong, and these ones are crazy and anti Christian. And he even says, like, people who rely on classical knowledge are just silly. So we see medieval people literally interacting with these classical sources.
Yeah.
Most of the time, a lot with a lot more respect than
Yeah.
Cosmos.
Not always in kooky ways like that guy did, but yeah.
Yeah. And I think the reason I highlight this is not to perpetuate the myth that medieval people thought the world was flat. Almost all medieval people knew it was round. But to get at this other myth that if classical knowledge existed, medieval people just passively accepted it.
Mm, mhm.
They were actually engaged. They were active readers. They were always questioning. And because of this idea that you brought up of the totalizing way in which all the knowledge needs to be somehow snapped together into place by God, that you actually have to actively engage it.
Mhm.
And you have to every time you sit down, not just say, okay, I guess that's the way things are, but wrestle with it and question it. Back to Bernard.
Yeah.
Medieval people are much more skeptical and critical and thoughtful than we generally give them credit for. This goes into the way I wanted to shift the discussion about knowledge of nature away from how did medieval people know classical knowledge to the fact that I am increasingly convinced that what hagiography is showing us is that the learned elite of medieval Europe are actually in conversation with the peasants and the farmers and the shepherds a lot more than we think. That it's local knowledge that is also seeping its way into this written evidence. That we see, for example, Gregory of Tours and some of his monastic brethren getting on on a boat and having a long, drawn out conversation with the guy running the boat about where the best fishing in the neighborhood is.
Mm-hmm.
That local agricultural practices are on display. People acknowledging local Kitchener knowledge in a way that we have for a long time assumed was just not done.
Yeah. This is really interesting because I think it gets at a pet peeve of mine, absolutely, which is that the assumption, even among, some scholars, that monasteries or church places or literate populations were entirely walled off from the outside world. That is absolutely. Hagiography shows us that extraordinarily clearly. All those desert hermits are never alone for even like a minute. They have people visiting, they have servants there, they have other monks showing up. Like those guys can't get a minute's peace to do their hermit stuff. And that's let alone like a giant bustling monastery, like not even just Cluny, like one of the huge houses of medieval Europe, but even like a smaller house has all these people kind of milling about. And a mix of classes, right? Like maybe the monks themselves are all of higher class. That's not a guarantee that that's actually true, but like they are interacting. They have to interact, with the local population like every day. And it's really neat when those sources kind of show those moments, right? But the other part too is you seem to be suggesting, and again, like this is blowing my naive little mind here, suggesting that they're interacting with the world around them in the medieval world, that they are thinking about not just received knowledge, but new ways of thinking about things. They are testing things out, they are exploring things. Like it seems like they're kind of doing science in some ways. But I was assured that medieval people didn't have science at all.
And here we get into two of my favorite things. One, the fact that science just means knowledge. Doing science in a pre modern disciplinary sense simply means expanding knowledge. And so, absolutely, medieval scholars are doing science all the way through. The very recent divisions between science and STEM and the humanities are just that. They're very recent. They're a product of modern hyperspecialization and the transformations of universities since they were started in the medieval world up until today. But that's another claim for medieval people doing not doing science, right?
Yeah.
The roots of our university system in Europe that was then inherited and transformed in America is in the medieval cathedral, is in the attempts by these people to read the book of nature in the same ways that we read the book of the Bible as evidence by God of the path that one should take to reach salvation. And so the more you understood about nature, the more you understood about how those pieces all interlock and how things really work, the closer you're going to get unlocking how one survives
Yeah.
this life and enters into the next one.
Yeah. If you actually look at the sources, I mean, that becomes so abundantly clear so quickly, just at a cursory glance. Like these people are ravenous to understand the world around them. They care very deeply about it because as opposed to and go back to Bernard, right? Like even like a city boy like Bernard in Angers, which is not like a big city in the 11th century, let's be clear. But like you need to understand weather. You need to understand kind of soil. You need to understand how water moves across a landscape. Like all of that stuff is super important in a pre-industrial world, right? Like the idea that nobody cared about it. My head goes back to kind of old academic Twitter when I remember like days of a contest in which some guy said like there was 0%. He used that phrase. I will always remember 0% science in the Middle Ages. And then like people were like, yes, the Enlightenment invented science. And then
Mhm.
like medievalists initially kind of very politely saying like hey guys, like I hate to break it to you, but like there was at least some percent science in the Middle Ages because like they tried to
Point two.
understand their will. Yes, yes, exactly. But it just seems like it's such a weird kind of zombie myth that still seems to kind of exist, right? In which again the evidence is just abundant that it's not true at all.
And I mentioned that this brought up two of my favorite things. My
Yes.
other favorite thing that this brings up is a person from right around the same time that Bernard is living and writing, a man named Lambert,
Mhm.
who is a canon, which is a type of monk, a type of monastic person. And he's working and living in northern Belgium at a place called Saint Omer. And he writes all by himself over the course of about 30 years, a universal encyclopedia of the world. It becomes known as the Liber Floridus, or
Mhm.
the flowery little book.
Amazing illustrations in those manuscripts too.
Yes, and it gets copied and gets moved on,
Yep.
and other
Yep.
people copy it, and they're wonderfully illustrated. Our very first one, though, he wrote by hand. We have what is his autograph, which is the one he made himself, including all the images. He also made his own images. And over the course of his entire adult life, out of a tiny little monastic library in northern France slash Belgium, he reads voraciously. He has conversations with all the visiting scholars who come to the nearby bigger town. And he just slowly builds up his own, honestly, internet.
Mhm.
He builds up his own way to move back and forth between categories of knowledge by turning the pages. He has a bestiary. He has a lapidary. He has a section on all of the healing medicinal plants of the Holy Land. He has a history of the world. He has Easter tables. He has a calendar. And here's where we're back to local knowledge,
Yep.
a universal calendar like a farmer's almanac that then says, okay, if it snows on the first Monday after the calends of April, then, for example, I'm making this up off the top of
Yeah.
my head right now, then the grape harvest will be good.
Yeah. Yeah.
This very in tuned sense of how all the different components of weather and climate and time
Mhm.
and harvest all intersect. He's a bookish monk. He doesn't plant, he doesn't farm,
No.
but he's accumulating all of this knowledge and giving it all kind of equal space.
Yeah.
He reads classical people, he reads medieval hagiography, he reads his basically contemporary newspapers. He's up to date on Belgium and Flanders in the Crusades. He reads ancient geographers. He even has a table where he puts in a fortune telling dice game so that you can literally roll the dice and answer
Yeah.
like magic 8 ball questions.
Long nights at the monastery, apparently. Yeah. So
Yes,
yeah.
yes. He wants all the things that he can possibly know
Yeah.
all in one place.
Mhm.
If that's not someone who cares about learning and science and nature and where people fit in nature, then I don't know what else could show that.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I mean, the argument comes from, right, like an enlightenment myth about kind of oh that dark ages kind of thing and blah blah blah, etc. All superstition all the time. There's some books you can read about that. One called The Bright Ages, for example. Just off the top of my
Yes.
head to confront that myth. But anyway, but it also it's more about the idea that the medievals weren't interested in their world, that they weren't kind of thinking in these particular ways. It just seems much more a product of our own modern world and our own kind of modern kind of preoccupations. Like we need it to be different than ourselves in some way to like draw boundaries about like, well, they were doing all those things, but that's not science because of this arbitrary thing that I'm kind of saying because that's what science is to me. It's not honest to the past, right? It's just not honest about what the past is.
It's also not honest about today.
Yes. Fair.
I'm sitting here in my office, and behind me is a stuffed dragon.
Hmm.
And in so many ways, dragons sort of stand in, and there's a great drawing of a dragon in Lambert's Liber Floridus. But dragons kind of stand in for all of this. Medieval people didn't know real things about the world.
Yes.
They believed fake things.
Yes. Yes.
They
Yes.
didn't,
Yes.
they were non-critical. They thought the inheritance of the classical world, they thought there were monstrous races all around the world with like 1 foot or only 8 apples. Medieval people were credulous. They
Yeah.
didn't believe real things and they believed in fake things.
Hmm.
And we go back to the elephant. One of the things that bestiaries said about the elephant was that the elephant's mortal enemy was the dragon, and that dragons would try to eat baby elephants when they were born. And so elephants develop these mating rituals and have babies in rivers and moving water so that dragons can't eat the babies. Some people look at the dragon then and say, oh, this is all the things medieval people didn't know. This is medieval people being credulous and
Hmm.
telling stories that aren't real and not knowing nature. We have Bigfoot. We have cryptozoology. We
Yeah.
have it's Halloween.
Shout out to since I'm in Appalachia, it's Halloween that we're
Yep.
recording this, and shout out to Appalachia, Mothman, big in Appalachia. Hmm.
No one says that people who enjoy telling stories about Mothman and Bigfoot don't actually also know about reality.
Yes.
People tell stories about nature in ways that are spooky and exciting and marvelous and maybe. And I think that so many times when we're asking that question of did medieval people know science, we're expecting them to be more completely rational than we are.
Yeah.
We don't give them space to know real things and also imagine other things that might exist and might potentially be real.
Yeah.
And that makes the world richer when we have space for mystery. So I think Halloween's a great day to have this
Yeah.
conversation because Halloween shows us like we want to play.
Yeah.
We want to imagine an alien spaceship abducting a cow. Like,
Sure.
we have fun with things like that. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean that we are fundamentally non-scientific or don't believe in reality.
Yeah, and I love the way that you frame that too about it leaves space for mystery, or the word that came to my mind is wonder. Because it's not necessarily that when they were telling these stories, or when they were writing these stories down, because that's how we have them, right? Like they're often produced in text and then reproduced, and then they make their way to us. Is that they were trying to figure things out, and it wasn't that they were necessarily saying this is the way it is, but they could revisit that story. They could re-understand things differently. Like the elephant's such a great example too from my own work when David and I were writing Oathbreakers, the book on the Carolingian Civil War. Like we talked about, there's an elephant in Germany in the early ninth century, and it makes its way maybe from West Africa, we're not entirely sure, but across North Africa, certainly over the Mediterranean, up through Italy, over the Alps, and then it makes its way to Germany, and it lives there for about 8 years, and then it dies because elephants should not be in northern Germany in the ninth century. They're just not suited for that climate. But like people saw an elephant like in Germany. And then even beyond that, like we are leaving out the vast majority of the medieval world, which is not Europe. Right? Like there were lots of people in the Middle Ages, like we were talking about at the very beginning, like who understood what elephants were. And those people interacted and they could have these conversations. So although, some bestiaries talk about dragons eating baby elephants and stuff like that knowledge is living right alongside the fact that people saw elephants. And they perhaps even saw elephants mating, and they understood those types of things too. So we can't assume, and we shouldn't assume from our perch here in 2025, that it was all one thing and it was all kind of backwards in this way.
I've also used elephants in something that's not out yet, but the preface that I wrote to a global cultural history of the environment that covers the
Mm,
medieval period. And I used the elephant to link together a bunch of these essays, not only because of the famous examples like a bull of us,
yeah.
but because they are such key examples of this idea of how knowledge of nature moves
Hmm.
and how mistreatment of animals and mistreatment of people, to go all the way back to Conk and Foy, can go hand in hand with these
Yeah.
processes, because every time you move an elephant in the pre-modern world, you're also moving an enslaved elephant driver.
Yes.
And the knowledge of how to feed and care for an elephant that moves all the way
Mhm.
from Africa or India to wherever it goes, that knowledge is there are some books about elephants in medieval India, but those books are not moved and translated. The enslaved elephant keepers are moved.
Yes.
And it's that idea that knowledge comes at a price that is also important to this conversation, that the acquisition of new knowledge and new animals and new plants and new spices comes, and we tell this story with the Columbian Exchange, that the acquisition of new knowledge is never a neutral thing,
No.
that
No.
it comes at the expense of other people very often.
Yeah.
And so we have to add in to conversations about how did medieval people, no matter where they were, get knowledge, is it's not always a positive route for that
No,
new
no, no.
knowledge to make it into the world.
Yeah, and like you said, because it's always people that are carrying that. That's the only way that information travels is with people, either orally or in text or some other form like that. And it is important to think about the people who were transmitting that knowledge, like you said, like with Abul Abbas, right? Like the other group that survives, like this transalpine crossing to bring the elephant north, is a Jewish person named Isaac, who was sent as a delegate. And like we have to think about his status within this Christian world, like. It's really kind of problematic to think about because I think there's an assumption that he was free. And like, I don't know if that's actually the case or not. It's probably not the case, but yeah. I do want to transition. We're kind of moving towards the end of our conversation, unfortunately, because this has been so great. Because I want to ask you, you are, if I am not remembering, and nobody can see what I'm seeing, right? Because I can see not only the dragon behind you, but I can see one other animal behind you in abundance over there, and that is the mighty penguin. So, can you tell us a little bit of something about like the pre-modern penguin?
Okay, so that's actually part of why I mentioned the Columbian Exchange there in the last
Excellent.
bit, because I suspected this question was
Oh,
coming.
I had to ask about the penguins. Come on.
My newest research project is on the global history of penguins.
Oh man.
And it's surprising. It begins in the what we would think of as the Middle Ages, broadly construed. Obviously, people relating with penguins is a long story, most of which we don't have access to because of the ways in which indigenous knowledge was lost as communities died out. But the European history with penguins, I used to think, wouldn't monks who wrote bestiaries have loved to have known about penguins?
Yeah.
Whole bunch of little black and white clad animals who huddle together and you can't really distinguish what their gender is, and they go months without eating, and like there's so many ways in which emperor penguins in particular, like wow, what a great metaphor for a monastery.
Yes.
But then I realized I was falling into the modern trap of thinking all penguins are emperor penguins,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and thinking that when you see a penguin you automatically know all of that.
Yes.
Looking back, at first, Europeans, it took a really long time for us to understand all the things that we now know about penguins.
Mm-hmm.
At first, when the very first Europeans encountered penguins, it was not actually with a sense of awe or wonder or look at these strange, marvelous birds, look at these little upright people in their tuxedos. The first recorded encounters that I've yet found were when Portuguese sailors were going around Africa, because penguins, of course, actually don't only live on the South Pole. They live throughout the Southern Hemisphere, including large portions of the coasts of Africa
Yes.
and South America and Australia. And so penguins are actually really widespread. The first penguins that were encountered by Europeans were black-footed penguins in South Africa, and the response of the people who saw these birds were, "Oh, those look delicious." And they killed them and ate them and ate their eggs.
Yeah.
That they
Yeah.
were not at all surprised to see black and white egg laying seabirds, because that's the Atlantic is full of puffins and cormorants and all of these black and white egg laying seabirds. And so the first Europeans who saw penguins just ate them.
Sure. That's shocking, but also like not surprising when you think about it for a minute. It's just like a bunch of sailors being like, what can we eat? Whatever we see, we're going to try to eat. So it's just
Yeah.
there it is. Let's eat it. So
Yeah, so the 1400s, we see Europeans encountering black-footed penguins for the first time. We only know about this because of elite people being on the ship and writing about it later. But it introduces the idea that all of the sailing ships that went around South Africa eventually would have encountered, if they stopped and landed at the right time of year, nesting penguins.
yeah,
And so we just don't get their voices of those early sailors.
no, of course. Yeah.
So that's throughout the 1400s. And then in the early 1500s, when Magellan and his
Hmm.
voyage is traveling, and Pigafetta, the Italian diplomat, statesman person, gets put on the ship and goes with them, they get down to the Magellanic Straits and they encounter South American penguins.
Hmm.
And once again, I was sitting there for so much of my interest in penguins thinking, oh man, medieval people would have just freaked out and would have been so amazed and so startled and would have put these right into the bestiary. And no, in fact, they just say, we found two islands full of geese and goslings, of which geese the large number could not be reckoned, for we loaded all the five ships with them in an hour.
Wow.
They're not confused at all. They know
No.
exactly what these birds are.
Hmm.
Their food.
Their food. They're not exactly the same, right? And of course it's important to remember, and I have to remind myself because I am poisoned by cartoons and popular culture to think that penguins exist in both hemispheres. They do not. They are a southern hemisphere animal, but puffins are northern hemisphere, and there's some sort of similarity there, at least kind of visually, at least on first glance. Was there any sort of conversation in these initial sources, kind of equating them, or like they're compared to geese in that source, which is really interesting. That's not the place my mind would have gone. But they're trying to take something weird and make it familiar, these Europeans, right?
Yeah, and in fact, what gets in the way for us is that the medieval sailors who are encountering these birds in Africa and in South America
Mhm.
as they are expanding European encounters, they know a lot of Atlantic seabirds. They know not only
Yes, of
puffins,
course. Yeah.
but they know cormorants and they know auks. And many of the auk species are black and white.
Okay.
But they also, at the point in the Middle Ages, they also know great auks.
Okay.
Great auks are a black and white North Atlantic bird that stand upright on two legs and cannot fly.
Oh,
And they were about a meter high.
okay.
And they were hunted to extinction in the early 1800s.
Okay.
And so, in fact, for a long time, European natural historians thought that penguins were auks.
So they just equated them.
Yeah, they are so similar.
I mean, it makes sense, I guess. Yeah.
And they're
Yeah.
not even confused by the flightlessness, because there's an example of
Yeah.
big black and white flightless ocean birds literally off the islands in the North Atlantic.
Yeah.
And so we now are almost more struck by the oddity of penguins than people would have been before we killed off the other bird that was most like them.
Yeah. It just like really fascinating too to think about, because what I think part of what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we expect medieval people to be kind of filled with surprise, wonder, shock, horror, fear, something like that. But their world was richer because, at least in the natural world, in some ways, because it was filled with species that we don't see because they're gone now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And relationships with nature that most of us living in an industrialized society don't have because they're gone now.
Yeah.
Lifestyles of labor and work and engagement and touching grass and touching dirt and growing
Mhm.
things, that holding a animal when it's born and killing an animal.
Yeah.
And there's a tangible relationship with the natural world that medieval people had across the board that most of us don't, I won't say get to experience, because I don't want to live in pre-modern Europe, but that most of us don't experience.
Yeah. And that maybe goes back to the very beginning when I was talking about, complicated relationships to time machines. Is like, I don't want to go back in time to study anything in the Middle Ages. I don't want to spend any time there at all because I like modern society. But, just reminding us that it was a different way of living, and one that is a little bit hard to imagine at times, but is possible to think about, and really kind of enriching to think about, I think, at times. So even with flightless birds like the penguins, or the long lost great auks. So
Yeah, I just went back and looked in my notes for the date, and the last great auk eggs were destroyed in 1844.
wow. But they used to just populate islands all across the Atlantic, right, for centuries. So in the 14th, 15th centuries, they would have been a relatively common occurrence.
And so you see a new one of them in Africa or in South America, and you're like, oh, hey, it's an auk.
Yeah. It's a slightly different looking auk.
Even
Yeah.
though that name actually didn't exist, but
Yeah.
oh, it's
Yeah.
one of them.
Yeah. A goose.
It's a goose.
A flightless goose, as the diplomat said. So
Yeah.
this is unfortunately, we are running out of time, but this has been absolutely fascinating and just so interesting. And I can't wait to hear more about penguins in the pre-modern world as well sometime in the future. So, Ellen, if people do want to learn more about you or your work, is there any place online that they could find out more about you?
I do have a website where I've put some of my research together and access to some of my books. My website is www.efarnold.com.
Excellent.
And on Blue Sky, I am Medieval Penguin.
Medieval Penguin. Perfect. Excellent. So, well, please go and find the Medieval Penguin on Blue Sky and check out Ellen's work. Thank you again so much for joining us. This has been an absolute delight. Thank you, everybody, to listening to American Medieval. And until next week, we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiaffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.